This is a lecture on the Muslim empires. This is section 2 of History 122, World Civilizations from 1600. Now, talking about the history of Islam is very difficult. It's a very kind of complex phenomenon in history, and people like to oversimplify things, I think. So there'll be a tendency for people to say, oh, Islam is this or Islam is that. And as a historian, I would stress that Islam is different things in different time periods for different people, right? So we're going to see how Islamic civilizations differed depending on the historical context in which Muslims lived. And I'm trying to be very careful here because it's important to understand, and one thing we'll see is that Islamic civilizations often had large numbers of people in them who were not Muslims, right? So Islamic civilization, when I use that term, I do not simply mean civilizations in which Muslims lived, but rather civilizations in which Islam was kind of the dominant force in society. But oftentimes, as we'll see, these societies have large numbers of non-Muslims living in them. And kind of my example in this section of how Islam can be different in different times and places is how different Muslim empires, Islamic empires, how they dealt with this issue of having non-Muslims living in their empires, of ruling over them. We will also try and understand why Islamic civilizations did not experience a scientific revolution despite their great wealth and power, as we discussed with East Asian civilizations. If you were to go back in the 14, 15, even into the early 1600s, in a sense, the places you'd want to live would be places ruled by the Islamic empires, because there's a lot of good things going on there. And so a big question we have is, why is it that even though the Islamic empires had kind of a head start on Europe, why is it that they fall behind? And a big reason is that they don't have a scientific revolution. And we're going to kind of understand why it is that they did not. Now, before we continue, I need to give you some background information on Islam, some notes on Islam, in particular some terminology. So first of all, one thing we have to emphasize is that there's a difference between the word Islam and Muslim. Islam refers to the religion. Muslim refers to the follower of the religion. Islam means literally to submit. And of course, the implication is submission to God, right? So Islam literally means to submit, but it's submission to God. Muslim means one who submits. So it's referring to one who submits to God, which of course is a person. And it's important to kind of understand that difference. Sometimes people will say, because they're used to saying, okay, a follower of Buddhism is a Buddhist, a follower of Christianity is a Christian, so a follower of Islam must be an Islam. And that's not correct, right? A follower of the religion of Islam is a Muslim. And so that's, and the reason we follow that is because that's the way that Muslims refer to themselves. So Islam was in a sense established by Muhammad, who's seen as the prophet of Islam. And one thing that's important to kind of understand about him, and this makes him different from another major religious founder such as Siddhartha Gautama, otherwise known as the Buddha, or Jesus, in that Muhammad was not only a religious leader, he was also early on a political leader. He actually, in a sense, governed very early on in his career. And then as part of that governing, as part of trying to protect and advance his religious movement, he also became a very skilled military leader, right? So he fulfilled a lot of roles, right? He's not just a religious leader, he was also a political and military leader. And so this created a major crisis in a sense when he died. There needed to be a successor, someone who would take over his role, at least as a political and military leader. There's arguments within Islam about taking over his role as religious leader, so I'm not going to go into that because that would make things too complex. But for our purposes, when he dies, it's not clear who should succeed him, and it's important that he has a successor because of his important role within the Islamic community as a political and military leader in particular. So what ended up happening was that there would be a successor to Muhammad who would be referred to as the Caliph, right? The Caliph. And Caliph, again, literally means just successor. Successor to who? Successor of Muhammad, right? So there is some conflict over who this person would be and how that how future people would be chosen to be the successor of Muhammad, right? So there is kind of an understanding among Muslims that there does need to be a successor to Muhammad, but there was disagreement among Muslims over who that successor should be in particular, and in general, how succession should be decided. How do you decide who should be the next caliph? And broadly speaking, there are two different forms of Islam. One is Sunni Islam, and that's the majority form of Islam. Something like 85-90% of Muslims are Sunni Muslims. There is also what's called Shia Islam. That is the minority religion, or minority form, I should say, of the religion, which is focused a lot in Iran and some neighboring areas in Iraq, which is one reason why there's sometimes some kind of conflict there. And there are some important differences between these two understandings of Islam. And we're going to talk about some different, how they impacted Islamic empires. But one thing we have to understand for the sake of this lecture and just about Islamic history in general, one major difference between them is who the caliph should be and how that caliph should be chosen. So for Sunni Muslims, it was understood that the caliph should be chosen by the community. Right, so in a sense, it's not that they have an election, but there should be a community consensus on who the caliph should be. So that means it makes it fairly broad about who could become caliph. It just needs to be a Muslim man who gains consensus from the community that he is indeed the successor of Muhammad. And that's the majority, that's the Sunni form. In Shia Islam, it is understood that the caliph needs to be a lineal descendant of Muhammad, right? So Muhammad didn't have any sons that survived into adulthood, but he did have a daughter, and she married, and so Muhammad had grandchildren, right? Grandsons. It was important. The male line is very important. But the key thing is he did have a line, right? There is a line of people descended from him, and Shia Muslims believe that the successor of Muhammad, the caliph, should be from that line. Now, early in the Islamic civilization, there was fighting over who should be caliph and how the caliph should be chosen, and the Sunni Muslims would become dominant. They would, and they of course become the majority form of Islam. But we'll be referring back to these terms as we continue on, so it's very important that you understand this. Now, there are basically three Islamic empires that we're going to be looking at. And it's important for understanding how this history from several centuries ago impacts our situation today. So I want to emphasize that all three of these Islamic empires, all three of these Islamic states we're going to be looking at, are all connected to various degrees to modern countries. And for these modern countries, these Islamic empires have an important impact on how they understand the world today. So you may have never heard of the Ottoman Empire, the Safavid Empire, the Mughal Empire, but the people living in those areas, living in those countries today, certainly have. So the Ottoman Empire, the first empire we're going to look at, is connected to modern-day Turkey. Right? The Ottoman Empire was much larger than modern-day Turkey, but the core, the center of the Ottoman Empire, basically corresponds to modern-day Turkey. The Safavid Empire is connected very closely to Iran, right, to the country of Iran. And there is this kind of strong emphasis that this Safavid Empire was kind of a golden age for the Iranian people. The Mughal Empire is most closely connected to India, right, is most closely connected to India. And all of these would have very different understandings of Islam. Ottoman Empire and Mughal Empire tended to lean towards Sunni Islam, in particular the Ottoman Empire, particularly as it got into conflict with the Safavid Empire. The Safavid Empire leaned more closely to Shia Islam. And that will all that is very important to their understandings of Islam. As I said earlier, we're going to look at how it leads them to treat the non-Islamic people in their empires. Now, one thing that's important to understand about history is that we're always kind of going back and saying, okay, well, to understand what we're talking about now, we have to talk about something earlier, right? And I think it sometimes makes things a little complex, but it is important. So before we start talking about the Ottoman Empire, the first of the empires we're going to talk about, we need to talk about the Byzantine Empire, because the Ottoman Empire is in many ways the replacement of the Byzantine Empire. It's the reason it was kind of destroyed. But sometimes, and if you've often maybe heard the phrase that Rome fell in the 5th century, right? The Roman Empire fell in the 5th century. And that is not quite correct. It's only, in a sense, half correct. The Western Roman Empire fell in the 5th century. The Eastern Roman Empire, otherwise known as Byzantium, will last until the 15th century. So Rome will continue, the Roman Empire will continue on for another 1,000 years after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, which included Rome itself. But the people of Byzantium, the Byzantines, understood and thought of themselves as the Roman Empire. And that's something that's very important for us to understand. Another couple geographic things we need to understand. You'll notice that there is an arrow pointing at the city of Constantinople. That is modern-day Istanbul, which is the capital of Turkey. Right in that area that says Anatolia, that is the equivalent in many ways, not exactly 100%, but that's basically where modern Turkey is today. Right? So the Byzantium used to rule much of what is going to become the Ottoman Empire, and the Byzantines understood themselves as being the descendants of the Roman Empire, right? They're the kind of continuation, like I say, the last until the 15th century, when they are eventually destroyed by the Ottomans. This here is the Byzantine flag, right? This is the Byzantine flag, this double eagle. And one thing you'll notice about the double eagle is that in addition to having a sword, it's one of its talons, it also has a globe upon which is a cross, and there is also a crown on which there is also another cross. So one thing we have to emphasize about this Byzantine Empire, Byzantium, is that it was Christian. This was a Christian empire, right? The Roman Empire had about since the 4th century or so, depending on how you count, been a Christian empire. And even though the western half of the Roman Empire would fall, Byzantium would maintain its Christian identity. And the Byzantines practiced what we call Orthodox Christianity. We don't have a whole lot of time to kind of go into what Orthodox Christianity is, but imagine it kind of looks like Catholicism, but with more ritual and no pope, if that makes sense. So it is a kind of very liturgically, ritually focused form of Christianity. One thing that's very interesting is that for the Byzantines, the language of worship was Greek, right? So this was a Greek-speaking Roman Empire, right? So the Byzantines, again, it's this empire that's considered itself Roman, but spoke Greek and was Christian, but it wasn't Catholic Christian, it was Orthodox Christian. So now we're better positioned to talk about the Ottoman Empire. And you can see here, if you look at this slide, that it is roughly corresponds to the Byzantine Empire, right? The Ottoman Empire is going to basically be the replacement for the Byzantine Empire. So instead of having this Greek Christian empire ruling this area, you're going to have a Muslim Turkish empire ruling this area. The Turks are an ethnic group. They're not, even though the vast majority of them are Muslims, they're not Arabs. They're their own ethnic group. And the Turks will form the center of the Ottoman Empire. And when the Ottoman Empire falls, as we'll talk about in a later section, what you'll have left is Turkey. But the reason I'm showing this map in particular of the Ottoman Empire is that you can see that it was expanding, right? If you look at those colors on the left where it says Ottoman Empire 1453, Ottoman Empire 1481, Ottoman Empire 1521, and so forth, you can see it's ruling more and more space. The Ottoman Empire was expanding. And in fact, you'll notice that it expands all the way up into southern Europe. And you can see Transylvania up there. You may have heard of Vlad the Impaler, the historical kind of figure that leads to the Dracula legends. He was fighting the Ottomans, and he was, in a sense, so cruel because that was how he was trying to intimidate the Ottomans so they would stop trying to take him over. But if you look up into the Austrian Empire, the Ottomans got all the way up to Vienna. Now, they were defeated in Vienna, but they did get all the way there. And they actually put Vienna under siege multiple times. The point I want to stress here goes back to the basic argument in this section is, first of all, that the Ottomans, this Islamic civilization, was extraordinarily powerful. It's expanding into Europe, right? It's expanding into Europe, right? You don't have Europeans expanding into Islamic lands. It's the other way around. And that just highlights just how powerful this empire was. And it also, of course, raises the question, well, how did the Europeans, manage to come back when they're facing and overtake this empire when it was so powerful that it was taking over Europe, including, notice, it takes over Greece, right? The country of Greece, the birthplace of Western democracy, is going to be taken over by the Ottomans. So I want to stress this is an extraordinarily powerful empire that European Christians saw as a major threat. How then did the Ottoman Empire come into existence? Well, first of all, as I said, the Turks are an ethnic group. They speak Turkish language, and a group of these people will convert to Sunni Islam. I have a question mark because a lot of times when people initially converted to Islam, they didn't really say, okay, I'm a Sunni or I'm a Shia, but later on they will understand themselves to be Sunni Muslims. And these Turkish peoples who converted to Islam would raid the cities and villages of the Byzantine Empire. And as the Byzantine Empire, and we won't, unfortunately, we just don't have much time to go into why it weakens, will become weaker over time, allowing these Turkish raiders to come in and attack and take stuff and leave. Right, that's what raiding is. You go into a town, you go into a city, you kill a few people, you take some stuff, and you leave. But as the Turks realized that the Ottoman Empire was weak, they decided not to leave. They would come into a town, they would come into a city, and they would capture it. Right? And not only did they didn't go in just like killing people left and right. They realized that if they were going to hold this town, hold this city, and extract resources from it, they would need to bring captured people and their skills into their growing state. So, for example, when they captured a city, they would put a Turkish person, an Ottoman official, in charge of the city, but they would often keep the tax collectors who had been collecting taxes. They would say, okay, you're going to keep collecting taxes. You're just going to do it for us now. Right? So they would leave in power administrators and other tax collectors who had been administering the city, collecting for the Byzantines, who had been collecting taxes for the Byzantines, and they just said, okay, now we're in charge. Right, so instead of administering the city for Byzantium, the Byzantine Empire, you're administering it for the Ottoman Empire. Instead of collecting taxes for the Byzantine Empire, you're collecting it now for the Ottoman Empire. Now, what's important, though, to understand is that a lot of these people, the majority of these people, were Christians who were being conquered, and there were also Jews as well who were being conquered as well. And what's important to stress is the Ottomans didn't say, okay, you guys have to now all convert to Islam or we're going to kill you. They did not do that at all. Instead, they followed what's generally considered Orthodox Islamic practice and allowed Christians and Jews to keep their religion as long as they paid a tax. Right? And this is understood because Muslims believe that Christians and Jews had received a revelation from God, and therefore they were classified as people of the book. They worshipped only one God, though Muslims would say they don't quite understand God correctly. They do understand themselves to be worshiping that one God. They had received revelation earlier, so you can't say to them, oh, convert or die. You have to say to them, you need to convert or pay this tax. Some Christians and Jews would just go ahead and convert to Islam. Others chose to pay the tax so they could maintain their religion. But the key thing here is what this meant was you really have this developing Islamic empire which is dominated by Muslims, but in which there were large numbers of Christians and Jews. Now, and so this was pretty tolerant. Now, it's not completely tolerant. These Christian Jews were definitely second-class citizens, but they were not simply killed for being Christians and Jews, and they were allowed in many ways to keep their religion as long as they paid the tax. And this allowed then a kind of snowball effect, because what the Ottomans would do then is they would use the taxes, the resources they extracted from those captured towns and cities to build up their armies and to go conquer another town or city, use that money to go conquer another town or city, and just keep rolling on until they took over pretty much almost all of the Byzantine Empire. Now, as we discussed in the section on East Asia, when you're governing a place, you need officials who are loyal and who are not corrupt. If the officials are disloyal or if they're corrupt, they're going to do a bad job that will make people angry, and they will eventually overthrow you. So, and what makes these things particularly difficult is sometimes even though an official, it may be personally loyal, a lot of times they may face pressure from their families. right? And they're going to tend to be more loyal to their families than the state. So, you can think about this. You're a government official. You want to be honest, but you're under pressure from your family to give your brother-in-law a job, right? Or, you've got this nephew that's kind of the guy that never does what he's supposed to do, but, he's your nephew, so you have to help him out. So there's this kind of problem, right? Because that may make sense for you trying to take care of your family. From the perspective of the government, that's not good, right? We want people to get jobs because they're competent. We want to make sure that the taxes collected by government officials goes to the government and not to the officials' families. So the Ottomans dealt with this in a very interesting way, right? We talked about how China did this with an exam system, but the way the Ottomans are going to deal with this is through what are called janissaries. So janissaries are soldiers and administrators, in other words, they're officials, who were recruited from Christian children who were forced to convert to Islam, right? Basically, what they would do is they would go into a village, and that's what you see on this picture here. They go into a Christian village. Remember, they controlled large parts of a territory with large numbers of Christians, and they would recruit smart kids, and those children would be forced to convert to Islam. They didn't have a choice, and here the Ottomans were violating what's considered Orthodox Islamic teaching, right? This is technically against Islamic doctrine. Now, I just have been emphasizing how the Ottomans had followed Orthodox Islamic doctrine in terms of allowing Christians and Jews to keep their religion as long as they paid a tax. Why, when they were following it there, and it made sense for them to follow it, right? That allowed them to expand their empire and keep stability. Why is it that they break the rules here? Well, the problem was, how do you find people who are loyal? People who will put the emperor first, or I'm sorry, the sultan, the name for basically the emperors of the Ottoman Empire were sultans. How do you get people to put their loyalty to the state above their families? Well, this is how you do it, right? You take these people away from their families, right? These Christian children were taken away from their families, were raised in the Ottoman capital of Constantinople, which they renamed Istanbul. And they are and they're trained and educated there, and they're cut off from their families. So they had no one to depend on except the Sultan, right? They're not around their family. Their family can't help them. They're isolated. The only way that they can survive, the only way they can thrive, the only way they can get a promotion is if they make the Sultan happy, right? There's no one else. They can't go complain to their mom and dad. They can't go ask their brother for help because they're not there. In addition, by forcing them to convert to Islam, they are cut off from their old religion, right? And the support it could offer, the loyalty it could offer. So they literally have no one to depend on except the Sultan, the Ottoman Emperor. So what happened then is the Ottoman Emperor now has a huge force of soldiers and administrators who have no choice but to be loyal to him. And these guys make an extraordinarily competent group of officials. They also make a very, 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 very powerful army. This is an image of Mehmet, who will take on the epithet the Conqueror. And I think it's fascinating. This shows that the Ottomans, even though they were expansive, they were very interested in military power and going out conquering other people, they also had a belief that you should appreciate beautiful things. And so I think it's fascinating that even though Mehmet is known as the Conqueror, he's called that because he conquered Constantinople and destroyed the Byzantine Empire, they chose to paint him appreciating flowers, right? I think that's kind of interesting. But Mehmet the Conqueror, thanks to the force of janissaries, now has an extraordinarily powerful force at his disposal. And the question then is, what will he do with this power? And what he will do is attack and conquer Constantinople, right? And this is basically the last bit of territory the Byzantine Empire has. Now, people for like 1,000 years had been trying to conquer Constantinople, and they found it very difficult. Right, you can see from this picture that it was surrounded by these massive walls, and it was very difficult to attack it because it was on kind of an isthmus. So you could only attack one part of the city, basically. The other parts were too powerful and too well fortified for ships to really do much against them. Right, so Constantinople was a very tough nut to crack. It was a very powerful city, and it was basically the last kind of bastion of the Byzantine Empire. And like I said later on, when it does get conquered, it's going to have its name changed from Constantinople to Istanbul. It was named after Constantinople, or it was named Constantinople after Constantine the Great, the Roman emperor who converted to Christianity and built the city there. But of course, like I said, it's going to get conquered by the Turks, the Ottoman Empire, and they will change the name to Istanbul. So the Ottomans will indeed conquer this great Christian city, right? And they will go in, and they will go to the Church of the Holy Wisdom, called the Hagia Sophia, and they will convert that great Christian church, the largest enclosed space in the world at the time, and I've been in it, and it's astounding, and they will make it into a mosque. Right, so you had this, the capital, the last bastion of this great Christian Greek empire has fallen. Its great magnificent church has been transferred into a mosque. For the Christians of Europe and indeed everywhere, this was terrible. Right, if you were a Christian, you were just like, oh my gosh, what did we do? You know, why is God angry at us that this would happen to us? For Muslims, though, right, this was a great conquest. And they said, okay, we are awesome, and our religion is true. Clearly, God has given us a victory in battle, right? Otherwise, how could we have won except with God's help? So we are awesome, and our religion is true. And based on this, complete destruction of this once great Christian empire, this occupation of its capital, its conversion of its great church into a mosque, the Ottomans then declare that their sultan is the caliph, the successor of Muhammad. And this puts the Ottomans squarely, in a sense, in the Sunni camp, because they're not descended from Muhammad lineally, right? They can't trace their line back to his daughter and grandson, but that doesn't matter if you're a Sunni Muslim. And most Muslims accept this, right? They accept that the Ottomans are indeed the caliphs because, hey, like I said, they just destroyed this great Christian empire. They took over its city, capital city, changed its great church into a mosque, and they're going to continue to threaten Christian Europe. However, there is a problem, right? There is a problem in terms of their conquest. Now, the reason why it was so hard to conquer Istanbul, or Constantinople, later Istanbul, the reason it had been so hard to conquer this city was because of its massive walls. Its walls were extraordinarily powerful. What made it possible, in a sense, or a key reason why the Ottomans were able to finally conquer the place, was because they used cannons with gunpowder to knock down the walls. And this was relatively new technology to have this kind of powerful cannon that could literally knock down these ancient walls that had stood for over 1,000 years. However, there is a problem here. The cannons were made by a Hungarian, by a non-Ottoman. Right? It wasn't the Ottomans who produced these powerful cannons themselves. They hired a Hungarian to do it. He'd actually offered to build the cannons for the Byzantines, but they couldn't afford his price. So he decided to sell it to the Ottomans instead. And the key thing is, what this indicates to us is, even though the Ottomans are extraordinarily powerful and are willing to use technology, they're not the leaders in developing technology or in understanding the science necessary to develop technology. Right? So the Ottomans at this moment look extraordinarily powerful, and they certainly are, but there is a flaw, right? Even though there's a willingness to apply technology, they're not developing it themselves. They don't understand the science that undergirds it. But for now, though, the fall of Constantinople will allow the Ottomans to expand their empire even further and increasingly dominate trade. And that's going to be one key reason why the Europeans will go out exploring later on. Now, the Ottomans will eventually go into decline. There are multiple reasons for doing this. I've kind of already pointed to one, and that's the failure to develop science. Now, one of the key reasons, though, is the growing power of the Janissaries. Remember, I said that at first, they have no choice but to be loyal to the Sultan because they've been taken away from their families, they've been taken away from their old religion. Well, what they eventually do is they develop a kind of class consciousness where they become loyal to each other. Right, so that instead of the Janissaries saying, oh, we got to always just do what the Sultan says, they say, hey, there's a lot of us. We're really powerful. If we work together, we can make the Sultan do what we say. And one thing that they force the Sultan to do is to allow them to have their own families. They get permission to marry and have their own families. So that kind of, so now they have their own families to be loyal to instead of the Sultan. So eventually the Janissaries develop this kind of class consciousness. They can push the Sultan around. They get their own families, and they start looking out for their family interests instead of doing what the Sultan wants. Eventually the Ottoman Empire, and you saw this earlier, it gets so big that it's difficult to actually administer. Right? Remember, this is a time before cell phones, before airplanes, before trains, or anything that can move much faster than a horse, really. So it was difficult for them to administer this gigantic empire, right? To send a message to the farthest reaches could take weeks or months. And, you can tell people what to do, but they're far away from you. They can just not do it. And there's not a whole lot you can do about it unless you want to invade them. And this meant there was also trouble collecting taxes. Right, they're going to, as their empire gets larger, they will have more and more duties, more and more jobs that they're expected to do, but at the same time they have trouble collecting taxes from the far-flung empire, which makes it harder to keep up their military and things like that. And they also start losing wars. Right, eventually the technological balance will kind of shift more and more towards the Christian Europeans in particular. One of is pictured there on the right. That's John Sobieski, the King of Poland, who actually came down in 1683 and helped rescue the Austrian Empire as it was being invaded by the Ottomans. He's the one who actually broke the siege at Vienna and drove back the Ottoman forces. So the Ottomans are going to go into decline eventually. And this brings us back, though, to this question of science, right? As I just mentioned, one thing that is going to make the Europeans so powerful is their ability to develop science and to apply it practically to give them power. The Ottomans, though, were ahead of the Europeans. They were wealthier. They were more powerful. So why didn't they develop science and gain that power? And why, even when the Europeans showed that science could give them power, why didn't the Ottomans develop and embrace a scientific revolution? Now, to kind of answer this question in the simplest way possible, I think it might help to look at a Ottoman Muslim astronomer, a man named Taqiyuddin. I've talked a lot about astronomy, and you may ask yourself, well, how does understanding how the stars move lead to power? There's lots of different reasons, but one key thing is it leads to the development of complex mathematics, and it helps people just start getting used to thinking about science. And once they develop that complex math and the kind of methods of science, they can apply to other areas that are more practical. So, for example, learning physics, so that learning astronomy helps you understand physics. Understanding physics helps you build and use powerful cannons. But Taqiyuddin wasn't to that point yet, but he was an astronomer, right? So one thing I want to emphasize, he was a Muslim who was a scientist. And he built an observatory with the help of the government. Now, here's the thing. Taqiyuddin thought science and Islam could go together just fine, but other Muslims didn't. Other Muslims opposed Taqiyuddin and actually saw science as a threat. They said that science is bad, that people who believe in science will cease believing in religion, and this is really bad. And some of these Muslims even opposed using printing, like printing presses, because they were afraid that it would allow for the circulation of books that would be against Islam. Right. So we have some Muslims, like Taqiyuddin, who think their religion and science go together just fine. And then you have other Muslims who see science as a threat, who see science as kind of challenging religious understandings of the universe, undermining religion. What's going to happen is these people are going to want to sabotage Taqiyuddin. They want to make him look bad. And there's a battle coming up, and the Sultan asks Taqiyuddin who is going to win the battle. Now you may say, well, why would you ask Taqiyuddin this question? Well, Taqiyuddin, being an astronomer, was also an astrologer, which is not a scientific area field, but early on astronomers and astrology tended to go together, right? And Taqiyuddin, based on his reading of the stars, told the Sultan, oh, you will win, right? The stars indicate that you will win. Now, in Taqiyuddin's defense, I don't think he could give any other answer. If he told the Sultan he was going to lose, I think he would have gotten in trouble. But he told the Sultan he was going to win, and then the Sultan, the Ottoman Emperor, lost the battle. And the people who were against science, the Muslims who were against science, said, see, we told you, this Taqiyuddin guy, this guy who claims to be a scientist, he doesn't know what he's talking about. This science stuff is bad. Perhaps this is even God's punishment, right, for following this science. So this will lead to the destruction of Taqiyuddin's observatory and the victory of anti-science Muslims against pro-science Muslims. So it's not that Islam was inherently anti-science, but some forms of Islam were hostile to science. And in this case, those people were able to gain power and prevent the development of a scientific revolution. If that battle, the Sultan would have won it, maybe that would have made room in the Ottoman Empire for those pro-science Muslims to gain more power, and that would have made maybe an Ottoman Empire's scientific revolution possible. But that's not how it happened, right? But the key thing I want you to really understand out of this is that it's not that religion and science are necessarily inherently incompatible, but rather that certain forms of religion are incompatible with science, whereas other forms understand religion and science going together just fine. So Islam, just like Christianity, is not inherently anti-science, but some forms of the religion are. And those forms of the religion that are anti-science become dominant in the Ottoman Empire, preventing the development of a scientific revolution.